Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for coming. That was a piece of Jewish music, Over the Rainbow, written by the great Harold Arlen and Yip Harburg. I started out, as you heard, playing jazz, which, of course, like everybody else, I thought was essentially African-American music. It was only later that I discovered that while much of it comes from the black experience, the actual songs that jazz is based on come primarily from Jewish writers. I mean, at one point it seemed to me that this group, the Jews in America, which never composed more than 2% of the population of the United States, these people contributed over 80% of the popular music. The 2% is actually a fact. The Jews have never been larger than that. The 80%, of course, I made up because nobody could know, but if it's an imaginary number, it's like pi, an imaginary number of significance. So I set out to discover what was not only Jewish about American popular music, but what was American about the Jewish experience, and that's essentially what the book is about. I've promised to read. Normally I don't read, I just love telling stories, but because there's a book involved, I'm going to read. Here's a little passage that tells you what I'm up The Jewish narrative, beginning with Abraham's covenant with God, is at the root of contemporary Western faith and philosophy. It's not simply faith in the veracity of a deal made centuries ago by a mythical man, Abraham, who may or may not have been experiencing an oral hallucination when God spoke to him. It is faith in something quite real, the commonality of all people, what I think of as the inner Jew in us all. Because if you can convert, then everybody carries whatever this is. Huh? It's interesting. Others may call it by a different name, but 1,000 years ago, when human sacrifice was the norm, excuse me, let me back up. Others may call it by a different, I'm not used to reading. Others may call it by a different name, but in principle it remains the same. For it seems to me that social justice, a radical concept 5,000 years ago, when human sacrifice was the norm, is inherent in the very idea of monotheism, the existence of the one God, the same God who spoke to Abraham. For if we believe there is only one true God who speaks directly to anyone who can hear, who can be moved by an individual's prayers, and who has made all people in his own image, then all people who have equal access to this single divine source are equal to one another. If A equals C and B equals C, then A equals B. It's the Euclidean proof of social justice in monotheism. I made that up. I mean, this idea that what the Jews contributed primarily in America was a narrative about social justice is not unique to me. But what is unique to me is seeing it play out in the popular music. Because I personally believe that if God is just a story, let's say there is no God, just for the sake of discussion, I know we're in a place that's built on the premise that perhaps God does exist. I mean, if God does exist, if there is a being, an all-seeing being, who not only knows what's in every one of our heads, but in the head of every plant and animal, sentience is still open question, not only here on Earth, but around the universe, all the galaxies, that's a miracle, let's face it. But if God doesn't exist, if there is no God, if God is just a story, then the fact that that story has moved so much human history, right? For 3,000 years, millions of people have been born, have been killed, carried on. That's an even bigger miracle, that a narrative, that a story can move so much history. And it really talks about how important a narrative, a story is to all of us, that we desperately need a story in our lives, something bigger than we are, something that defines us, and quite frankly, something that links us to one another. I have another thing I want to read, and it goes something like this. It's been well documented how important America has been for the Jews, a true homeland where they could finally move freely, participate openly, and ultimately become who they were, whatever that was. Some have opined that if the authors of the Bible had only known about this land beyond the sea, it, and not Palestine, would have been the promised land. But how important have the Jews been to the formation of this land? Specifically, how did their overwhelming participation in the business of popular music create the songs that America has used to sing itself into existence? Not just how deep did their roots extend into the soil of America, but how might their Jewishness have actually brought about that ecology? And what I mean by that is quite simply that this country was not founded on the principle of social justice. It was founded originally on the premise that everybody should be able to do what they want, okay? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's the only country in the world where we're guaranteed the pursuit of happiness in the Constitution. Think about that when you think about the Arab Spring in the Middle East and the constitutions that are coming there. I guarantee you the pursuit of happiness is not part of their budding constitutions. The pursuit of happiness. Here's a great example. Let's talk about the Statue of Liberty. Statue of Liberty was given to the United States in the late 19th century by the country of France to celebrate the French and American partnership, you know, in the principles of liberty and equality, but primarily in the action of trade. And it took a while before they actually put the Statue of Liberty up in the harbor of New York. The reason was the statue was given to the United States for free, but they didn't have what they called a pedestal to put it on. And if you've been there, you know the pedestal's quite something. And they had to raise money among all the common people of New York, common people meaning not rich people, regular people, to come up with this pedestal to put the Statue of Liberty on. There was a young girl, a Jewish girl actually. Her name was Emma Lazarus. And she was trying to raise money, so she wrote this poem. Well, the poem was inspired by she had been walking along the wharfs of the Lower East Side of New York, and she saw the first wave of what became over 2 million Jewish refugees who were chased out of the Pale of Settlement, that part of Russia that was set up as kind of, what's the word, a reservation for the Jews. While in the Pale of Settlement, they couldn't own land, they couldn't work at normal businesses, they couldn't vote, they couldn't do much of anything. They could work in the rag trade. They could take literally rags and sew them into clothes and sell them. That's what they could do. So she saw them huddled on the docks, and she wrote this poem, which most of you know, of course. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Emma's poem has recast the discussion. America was now to be the homeland for all those in exile, the poorest of the poor. It was about the opportunity to change. It was about social justice. In short, it was about the Jewish narrative. No longer just a former British colony, not simply a remnant of the French or Spanish or Dutch colonial expansion, but a new America, the promised land for a people who had traditionally traveled with little more than the skin on their bones and the ideas in their heads. The story of Emma Lazarus and the Statue of Liberty can be seen as a story of assimilation as something the Jews did to other people. Or it could be a blazing example of how America was searching for the Jews, even as the Jews were discovering America. To that end, I'd like to play another song for you that demonstrates just how I see the Jewish influence creating the ecology of American social justice and who we claim we are to the world. In 1907, the Jewish newspaper of record, the Forward, the Fovitz, was trying to help these over 2 million Jews who washed up on the shore between 1880 and 1920. So they came up with an article on this new game called baseball. Brand new, baseball. You want to be an American, you got to know about baseball. There was a guy named Albert von Tilzer, budding songwriter. Von Tilzer never been to a ball game, but you know, he wrote songs. The Jews had got in the songwriting business because the white shoe Anglo-Saxons didn't want any part of it. It was a pennies business. They wrote songs about whatever was happening. So he wrote this song about baseball, never having been to a game. And if you listen to it, you know it's not just about baseball. It's about finding a place that's home. Thank you. I won't go over to my reading chair because I want to play another song for you right away. But so you get my point. Up until the turn of the century, popular music in America was not American. It was based on British music hall music like Gilbert and Sullivan. It was based on Viennese waltzes. But there wasn't American popular music. There was minstrelsy, of course, and the book goes into detail about minstrelsy. I won't. There's, silly Daisy, Daisy, tell me your answer true. One of the things that's interesting about these songs, and this is a question of what is Jewish music? You know, there are no Jewish notes on this instrument. We have 88 keys. Everybody gets to play all of them. So what is Jewish music? I mean, I alluded to the fact that part of the difficulty is knowing who a Jew is, right? Because if anybody can convert, then we all have the inner Jew. But what is Jewish music? What is Jewish about Over the Rainbow or Take Me Out to the Ball Game? What's a Jewish move in music? Well, there is one. And in fact, it was something that Cole Porter once said, that he had to learn it before he could write popular American music. And it's the reason why American music, popular music, has changed popular music around the world. And it's this. People think that Jewish music is minor music. Minor, right? But minor music isn't Jewish. There's minor music everywhere. No. What Jewish American music is, it's minor in context of major, right? I'll give you an example. Let me play you a major scale. Nice, huh? Okay. Now let me play you a minor scale. Same notes. What makes it major or minor? The context. Whatever note's in the root. Major, minor. Okay. So you have this minor that's built into the major. The great composer Shostakovich once said, that's what's Jewish, what he referred to as smiling through the tears. This tragedy, but yet on the other side, the sun is shining through, being able to laugh at the hard parts of life. That's what's Jewish. And you can see it in the great Jewish songs that we have. I'll give you an example. George Gershwin. George Gershwin, a genius. I mean, there are geniuses, and they walk the earth. Irving Berlin was one. Gershwin was one. Bob Dylan is one. Gershwin, he started out, it's funny, he wanted to get involved in Yiddish theater music because in the 20s, that was a business. Although the great Jewish comic Joe Smith once said that breaking into Yiddish theater was a lot like breaking into prison, still, it was professional. Gershwin went to talk to Shalom Segunda, a composer of Yiddish music. And Segunda talked to him a little bit and said, nah, you're not Jewish enough, you're an American. Gershwin then went to Irving Berlin to be his musical secretary. Berlin said, nah, too Jewish. So now, here's George Gershwin. Basically what he's been doing is hanging out in Harlem with James P. Johnson and Fats Waller, and he can't get involved in this Jewish business. So he starts composing, and of course you know the story. He writes American in Paris. He writes Rhapsody in Blue when he's a young man in his early 20s. He's very gifted. But he really wanted to create what he called the Great American Opera. The New York Opera is what he called it. So he started out, he got the rights, he thought, to something called the Dybbuk. The Dybbuk was a Yiddish play about a golem, a magical creature that was half dead, half alive. But he couldn't get the rights for it. So he used some of the same songs for something else he was working on called Porgy and Bess. And let me play a little example from Porgy and Bess where you hear the major and the minor in context. huh? Minor. Smiling through the tears. I like it over here. I don't like it so much over there. I think it's more lonely to be an author than a musician. I'm kind of in here. I'd like to be there. Actually, that's my comfort zone. I'll stay here. So I'm here primarily to introduce you to this book. But in a way, I'm also here to introduce you to me. How did I come to write this book? Why did I spend 8 years of my life writing this book? It's a good question. I think I have to go over there. Okay. So, you know, when I was growing up, I had a bar mitzvah like everybody had a bar mitzvah. And I spent 2 years studying for my bar mitzvah. And eventually I stood up in front of, well, this was back when most of the members of the congregation were Holocaust survivors, refugees, Yiddish speakers primarily. And I not only did I do the bar mitzvah, but I did the Musaf service afterwards. I did the Friday night service before. Didn't understand a word I was saying. And it occurred to me, you know, you're supposed to give a speech at your bar mitzvah to talk about the significance and the meaning of this event. And it's to take a young boy, just at the age of social discomfort, have him memorize a series of utterances and then say something about its meaning was a perfect way to alienate a young person. Then it occurred to me, well, maybe that's the point. Maybe I'm supposed to be alienated. And in fact, of course, as you know, one of the great contributions of Jews in America is codifying alienation. Who better to be an outsider? And in America, you know, it's not just the Jews that are outsiders, but we're all outsiders. Everybody in America is an individualist, right? It's the Wild West. But yet, of course, I didn't bring it up. I'm not going to bring it up. Too Jewish. But then I got involved in jazz, you know. I mean, just at the time I had my bar mitzvah, I also discovered a record by Horace Silver that I just loved. And there was a trumpet player on the record named Blue Mitchell, who I literally thought was talking to me. I would listen to that record so often. I would hear Blue talking to me. And then it went beyond that, and I thought Blue Mitchell was related to me. And when I found out that Blue Mitchell was black, and that most of these people were black, I knew immediately that black was just a color, that there were no races, that there was the human race. I mean, it just made perfect sense. I grasped that. But it took many years until I realized that while African-American jazz musicians played their liturgical music, gospel-influenced music, Jewish jazz musicians never or rarely referred back to the Jewish music. Reading, I found out why. You know, they asked Irving Berlin, what does being Jewish have to do with your success as a songwriter, Alexander's Ragtime Band, etc.? He said, absolutely nothing. Said, I'm an American, I write American songs. Keep in mind, this is a guy who came to the United States 6 years old, spoke no English, spoke Yiddish. By the time he was 19, I'm talking about 13 years later, he wrote Alexander's Ragtime Band. He wrote a hit in a different language. Now, I've been trying to learn Spanish for 20 years. I can barely order. And yet these guys, they were amazing. They did this. So they asked Irving Berlin, so what's Jewish about what you do? Irving Berlin said, absolutely nothing. I'm an American. I write American songs. They asked George Gershwin the same thing. Mr. Gershwin, please tell us, what's Jewish about your work? He said, absolutely nothing. Being a Jew has nothing to do with it. I'm writing the great American opera. And then it occurred to me, saying that being a Jew has nothing to do with it is the most Jewish thing you can say in America. Absolutely. So then I got it. I got it, that Jewish jazz musicians were playing Jewish music, that American popular music was based on certain aspects and certain forms that were delivered to America by Jews, and primarily Jews from the Pale of Settlement. Primarily the mystical, crazy Jews, not the Jewish businessmen from Germany who were already citizens, but these people who came totally rootless, who had no connection to being a citizen or to being part of a country. And they came to the United States and they invented it out of whole cloth. They invented businesses out of whole cloth. They invented the film business out of whole cloth. And by the 1920s, just a few decades after the Jews arrived, every major studio in Hollywood was run by a Jewish refugee who grew up within 100 miles of Warsaw, Poland. Another example, the fashion business. So the Jews came here and they were experts in the rag trade. They could take old clothes and make them look new again. They came to the United States just at the time when the sewing machine had been invented. And you see pictures on the Lower East Side, these guys schlepping the sewing machines from place to place. These were Jewish entrepreneurs. And within 10 years, they had invented the exact size clothing industry. Why is that important? Well, up until then, if you wanted to look good, you had to be rich. You had to afford a tailor. But once the Jews invented exact size clothing, they democratized, they made the middle class look good, feel good. Everybody could do it. It's part of the Jewish impulse towards social justice. If I leave you with nothing else, I want to leave you with that. That's the core of the Jewish narrative in America. What's American about the Jewish experience? That's American. I'm going to skip ahead because, I have no idea what time it is, but I suspect it's time to move out of the 20s. And I have lots of good stories I could tell you. There are great stories about the 30s, 40s, fantastic stories. 50s, there are some good stories. Great stories about the 60s, 70s, not so good. You can ask what happened to, briefly, I'll compress a little history for you. In the 30s, you had the Depression, of course, and the collapse of all the major record companies. And with the collapse of the major record companies, all folk music, ethnic music, blues, country music was given up by the major companies and taken up by these little Jewish record companies. The primary example that I like to talk about is Milt Gabler. Milt Gabler started out at a little record store in New York, Commodore Records. And by the way, I should be reading this because this is a book reading, but all this stuff is in the book. These stories I'm telling you are here. And look, I even went through it and I made these tabs, but you know, Irving Berlin once said, when they asked him why he never learned to read or write music, he said, in the time it would take me to learn to read or write music, I could write 3 hit songs. So I did this, but by the time it would take me to go through them, I could tell you a good story. So I'm going to tell you a good story. Milt Gabler started this little record company because he loved the music and all the major companies had given it up. And he loved Billie Holiday, the great singer. And Billie Holiday was signed to Columbia at the time. And there was a song that Billie Holiday had been presented. It was called Strange Fruit, and it was written by a man named Abe Meeropol. Abe Meeropol a lefty Jewish teacher from New York City. And she liked the song, but she was afraid to perform it in public. It was controversial. It was about black bodies swinging from the trees. It was about lynching. Columbia refused to record it in any case. And Milt Gabler not only encouraged her to record it, but started this label so that it could be distributed. And it became a huge hit and one of her signature songs. Milt Gabler went on to record lots of great songs, rhythm and blues songs, and the first rock and roll hit song by Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock. So when you look at the 30s and the 40s, you see all these Jews, some of them not so interested in the music, some of them basically gangsters. A couple of them really just got in the record business because they were in the injection molding business. One guy named Hy Weiss, I think his business was toilet seats. He injection molded the toilet seats. He figured, you can make a toilet seat, you can make a record, you just inject. Not everybody was in it for the music. But even people with crasser motives documented great music. But when you get to the 50s, where are the Jews? I mean, you got Steve Lawrence and Edie Gourmet, but you don't have a lot. You got Elvis Presley, you got Jerry Lee Lewis, you got all these white, dare I say, Southern Baptist performers. Well, the Jews were right there behind them. Jews like Lieber and Stoller wrote all the Elvis Presley hits. Jews from the Brill Building in New York, Carole King, Jerry Goffin. These people wrote little playlists, little narratives, these songs. You remember Charlie Brown? You remember Poison Ivy, these songs? These songs are little stories. Again, keep in mind, it's about the narrative. And the Jewish narrative is always about the average guy, the person who's going to come in off the street and survive despite conditions. Here's a classic Jewish song from the 50s. Say the neon lights are bright on Broadway. They say there's always magic in the air. When you're walking down the street and you ain't have enough to eat, then glitter rubs right off and you're nowhere. They say the women treat you nice on Broadway, but just looking at them gives me the blues. But how you gonna make some time when you ain't got but one thin dime won't even shine your shoes. Say that I won't last too long on Broadway. They say I catch a Greyhound bus, that's what they say. But they're dead wrong, I know they are, 'cause I can play that there guitar, and I won't quit till I'm a star on Broadway. On Broadway. On Broadway. Thank you. Well, that's the 50s. It's not really the 50s. This is a fine old Jewish tradition I'm doing up here, right? A little song, a little dance, a little seltzer in the pants. I could go on. But there's two more songs I definitely want to play, and time is short. So I'm going to continue. Here's what I'm going to do. I'll play two more songs, tell a couple more stories, ask if you have any questions. I have questions. We'll talk about it. We'll have another drink. We'll talk, have another drink. I'll sign books if anybody wants to buy a book. I mean, that's the premise of why I'm here. I'll be straight up with you. I came here to the Marin JCC to sell you books. A lot of people won't tell you that. I'm going to tell you that. Here's a couple of stories. You come to the 60s, and of course it's my favorite decade because I do remember it. Although, you know the saying, if you remember it, you weren't there. I remember it, I was there. And what I remember is the influence of Bob Dylan. I remember, I worked in a record store in Madison, Wisconsin at the university, and I was there before the Beatles made their records and before Bob Dylan. And we would sell, you know, folk records, we would sell Barbra Streisand records, we would sell the DGG Von Karajan Beethoven 9 set that was a big seller. And then this guy showed up who couldn't sing at all, who was writing literary lyrics. I thought to myself, my God, I could do that. I can't sing at all. I can write literary lyrics. Of course, I didn't do it, but I thought I could, and so did hundreds and hundreds of other people. Bob Dylan did an interesting thing. He said it himself. He said, I killed the professional songwriter. Because after Bob Dylan, everybody had to write their own songs, whether you were any good at it or not. And most people are not that good at it, and that's the story of rock and roll. Bob Dylan killed the professional songwriter. Yes, he did. And subsequently, he opened the floodgates. Again, what was Jewish about Bob Dylan? What is Jewish about Bob Dylan? You know, Bob Dylan went out there, and the first thing he said is that he did not come from this very Jewish community in Hibbing, Minnesota. No, indeed, he came from New Mexico. Not only that, but he wasn't Jewish. What do you mean? Well, it's true he had a large nose. He copped to that. But he said it was Cherokee. It was a Cherokee nose. That's what he said. And you have to ask yourself, what's more American about being a Cherokee than being a Jew? But Bob Dylan did something that was dramatically profound, and that is, he didn't just kill the professional songwriter. He made popular music about the person. Nobody cared if Paul Anka sang the song Diana. Nobody cared if there was a girl named Diana that he really loved, right? But when Bob Dylan sang Times Are Changing, Blown in the Wind, everybody believed not only the premise, but that the man behind the premise believed it. There was a moment of veracity and truth-telling there that had never happened before. The fact that he sang it in a voice that was not his own, the fact that he did not believe in the causes that were going on, neither here nor there. It's one of the great ironies of American popular music. It can accomplish very big and very good things, sometimes for the wrong reasons. Keep in mind the injection molding business. So the question remains, and I'm here to answer it, what was Jewish about Bob Dylan? And I'll say it right here. What's Jewish about Bob Dylan is, number one, he said being Jewish had nothing to do with it. Number two, he changed his name from Bob Zimmerman to Bob Dylan. Number three, he transformed himself. And in the end, Bob Zimmerman ceased to exist. There is no Bob Zimmerman on the planet anymore. There's Bob Dylan, but Bob Dylan can't go home again. Bob Dylan lives on a tour bus. Bob Zimmerman is gone. And he rarely discussed his Jewish roots. But he did write a couple of songs that make direct reference to the Jewish experience. And one of them is a song called Highway 61. And in the song Highway 61, he starts with a verse that's taken directly from the Torah portion that's read during the high holidays, during Rosh Hashanah. It's a portion called the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. You all know it. It's the most troubling part of the Torah, where God says to Abraham, get your son, take your son, your only son, which wasn't true because he had another son named Ishmael, but that's another story. Take your son, the only son, the son that you love, take him up there and sacrifice him to prove that you believe in me. Now, what kind of God would ask somebody to do that? What kind of man would do it? But this is why it's such a troubling part of the Bible. So Abraham takes Isaac up to the top of the mountain and binds him and takes the knife, and he's about to kill him. And an angel says, okay, just kidding. You don't have to kill him. Just kidding. It's okay. Because you went along with my routine, you can turn him loose. And the first verse of Dylan's Highway 61 is this verbatim. Now, it tells us two things. Number one, Dylan knew the Torah very well. Dylan loved the Torah. Why? Because of the narrative. Remember, if I don't tell you anything today, I'm telling you this. The Jewish experience is about telling a story that has changed the world. Okay. Dylan knew the Jewish narrative. Number two, Highway 61 is about a highway that runs from essentially Duluth down to New Orleans. It cuts the country in half. It runs right through the Mississippi Delta. It runs through the home of the blues. It runs through the famous Stovall plantation where Muddy Waters served. Not only is it a prototypical American road, but Dylan uses the verses to set up a situation where ordinary people are on the brink of the well. They have to act, which is exactly what happened to Abraham when God said this. It's a very American and a very Jewish moment, becoming responsible for the higher social justice that you're being called to do. It's about the moment. It's a very Jewish song in that sense. So, having said that, said to Abraham, kill me a son. Abe said, man, you gotta be putting me on. God said, no. Abe said, what? God said, do what you want. Abe, but the next time that I'm coming, you better run. Abe said, where you want this killing done? And God said, Highway 61. Now, Georgia Sam, he had a bloody nose. Welfare department gave him no more clothes. Asked poor Howard, said, where can I go? Howard said, there's just one place I know. Tell me quick, said Sam, 'cause I gotta run. Oh, Howard just pointed with his gun. He said, back down, Highway 61. Well, now Mac the Finger said to Louis the King, he said, I got 40 red, white, and blue shoestrings. I got 1,000 telephones, don't none of them ring. He said, man, you know I might be able to off these things. Louis the King said, yeah, it's easily done. We just put up some bleachers out on the sun, have it all back down on Highway 61. Now the roving gambler, he was very bored. He was trying to start the next world war. He found a promoter who nearly fell on the floor. He said, man, I never engaged in this kind of thing before, but yeah, it can be done. We just put up the bleachers out in the sun, and we have it all back down on Highway 61. Thank you. So here we are. We've raced through the decades. We've talked about the Jewish narrative. I've promised you a glass of wine and a book, maybe a cookie, I don't know. I really enjoy this. I enjoy the opportunity. I've got some great friends here that I haven't seen in a long time. Some people I don't know, but I'm very happy that you've come out to have this little fun with me. Talking about Jews, music, and the American dream. As I said, it's not rhetorical for me. It's what made sense out of memorizing that Haftorah. It's what made sense for me, memorizing 3 hours worth of sounds that I couldn't translate. I specifically, when I went to the temple with my father when I was a young boy, remember standing and watching these old Jews davening and thinking it was my first jazz experience. And I specifically thought about the Hebrew as it was chanted. You know, I read Hebrew the way I read music, for the sound of it. So this is not just casual or arbitrary. This is something I'm delighted to be able to present to you. I want to do one more song. I know this is a Jewish song because I wrote it. Life's a lesson, you can fail it. You can set your spirit free or jail it, but setting it free is no guarantee it's gonna fly when you sail it. The object is to ride it, but setting it free while you're sitting astride it isn't easy. And you can learn a lot by going crazy. You can fail it, you can set your spirit free or jail it. Setting it free is no guarantee it's gonna fly when you sail it. And if you feel like you're in prison, no one is coming to talk or to listen. Take it easy. Know that no one ever has it easy. Take it easy. You never learn to fly by freezing. Life's a lesson you can pass or fail. If you feel like you're in prison, no one is coming to talk or to listen. Take it easy. No one ever has it easy, girl. Take it easy. You never learn to fly by freezing, boy. Life's a lesson you can pass or fail. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Questions? Any questions on any topic? I'm happy to discuss. I won't do baseball, but I'll do anything. If there are questions, please feel free that we have microphones here. You could come and ask it. We have a questioner right here.
All right. I'd like to ask you about Jewish musicians changing their name. You mentioned Bob Dylan. His son-in-law, Peter Himmelman, is also quite gifted, and he talked about his agents wanted him to change his name, and he didn't. And then there's people who did. Perry Farrell was born Bernstein of Jane's Addiction, and Leslie West of Mountain was Laurie Weinstein. So you didn't, and just kind of your general thoughts on it.
Yes, well, I mean, it's a very Jewish thing to do, to change your name. After all, you know, if you're a Jew, your name was not your name in the first place. Your name, if you're a Jew, is the name that they call you to the Bima. Like my name, my Jewish name is Baruch ben Aryuleh, Ben, son of Lewis. Ben Sidran is a name that goes back, I suspect, to the town of Sidra, which is near the town of Druhichin, which is on the border between Poland and Belarus. I think that's where a Sidran came from, I don't know. And he wasn't originally a Sidran, he was a Sidransky. My grandfather was Boris Sidransky. So it's very easy for a Jew to give up his name or her name. The name wasn't the name. It was just passed on. And you go back to Irving Berlin, wasn't Irving Berlin. You know, he was Israel Baleen. The most famous example of should you change your name or not goes back to Simon and Garfunkel. You know, they were originally made their first records under the name Tom and Jerry. And they were convinced that they had to use their names, even though they were very Jewish names. I mean, if you remember in the 60s, Garfunkel, not a popular, you don't see a lot of them, by a producer, Tom Wilson at CBS, who was a jazz fan, who really didn't particularly like their music, but said, I'll produce you, but you're going to have to use your own names. So it's a fine old tradition, and I didn't have to go through it.
Hi, that was a good talk, thank you. I'm wondering, well, two things. One, like everyone who comes from an immigrant family, our original name was changed too. It was originally Malinowski, and now it's Malin, so it really is part of the history. The question I had for you is this. I'm wondering if you could say a few words about Marshall Chess and how he fits into your narrative, because I think he does in many, many interesting ways. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Absolutely. Chapter 8, Marshall Chess. No, the Chess family, fantastic story about how they came to Chicago, how they moved into the ghetto on the south side, how when Marshall would get on the phone, people didn't know if he was black or white or what he was, because he was so used to talking street talk, is what he did. He's not a big fan. He was not a big music fan. He ran a liquor store. And, you know, on the south side, it was during the point where the black migration came up from the American South in the 40s. And thousands of African Americans were coming to Chicago. And on Maxwell Street, in this area in Chicago, they set up amps and they started playing. And so there was this influx of rural African American music, as opposed to the urban African American music, which you would, I mean, in its apogee would be Duke Ellington, but it could also be Louis Jordan. It could be any number of urban forms. The Chicago form was much more rural. And so the Chess family had opened up a liquor store, and they put a little performing space in the liquor store, and pretty soon, you know, the performing space did better than the liquor store, and they opened up a club. And they became entrepreneurs and started recording these people. And eventually, Chess Records became the label because of a distribution deal with Jerry Wexler and Atlantic Records that crossed the ocean, that got to England, that turned on the Rolling Stones. And so when the Rolling Stones in the 60s came to the United States, the first thing they wanted to do was go to Chess Records in Chicago. And they, along with people like Mike Bloomfield and some of the Chicago blues musicians, turned America on to this music. And if it wasn't for these young white guys, a lot of very important African-American artists would be lost forever. And so the Chess brothers, even though it wasn't because of music, they contributed dramatically to the preservation of this form.
Well, just to follow up, they're very entrepreneurial.
Absolutely.
So when someone like Chuck Berry came, who was also very entrepreneurial, it was a match made in heaven. And they both had a mutual interest in each other, and they were able to do exactly what you said.
for those of you who can't hear, he says that Chuck Berry was also entrepreneurial, like the Chess Brothers, and when they got together, it was a match made in heaven. I don't know if I would say heaven, because Chuck Berry was not a nice man, but it was certainly a match made in the United States. And absolutely, it's a business of opportunity and a business of the moment. You know, some of those songs, like a Chuck Berry song, he would record it on Tuesday, and by Saturday it would be a hit. I mean, the business was that fast then. Yes, please. No, you don't want to?
As a young person, I went to every Alan Freed rock and roll show in New York.
Mentioning Alan Freed. Alan Freed, a Jewish DJ out of Cleveland, Ohio originally, who really, they say, coined the term rock and roll, and was also very much on the take, you know. I mean, if you look at a lot of these early songs by Chuck Berry, whatever, you'll see Alan Freed's name on it as a co-composer. He didn't do anything except play it, but then he would take a percentage of the song, and eventually he and a lot of the DJs were busted for this. Not for this, but for taking money. They made rock and roll movies. They made rock and roll. And they also created situations where, just like Benny Goodman back in the 30s integrated swing music, Alan Freed helped integrate rock and roll concerts by having blacks and whites and everybody participate in his, what did he call them, Moondog parties or whatever? Up until then, they were very much segregated, that's right. Yeah. And that's a big part of what the Jews did. You know, the relationship between African Americans and Jewish Americans historically has been very, very tight and symbiotic, and one of the great tragedies, I think, of the 20th century is what happened in the late 60s that drove a wedge between those two communities. They have so much in common. I mean, first of all, one of the things that the Jews did is you have this parallel experience in slavery, but whereas the African Americans came from an oral tradition with no when they got to America, they were stripped of their language, stripped of their music, they had no way to contextualize it. Here come the Jews with the story about slavery, so they contextualized the African American experience in terms of this narrative of social justice, and it was very important. And you see, if you trace the Jewish experience all the way up, you'll see the Jews leading the way, even up to the freedom rides in the 60s. You know, it's amazing. More than 50% of the students who participated in the freedom rides were Jews. And as I say, the Jews never accounted for more than 2% of the people in the United States. It's always been a very tight experience. How it fell apart in the late 60s is a long story, but it's a tragedy. Yes?
You know, I'm always surprised about songs that I didn't know were composed by Jewish songwriters, like Take Me Out to the Bar. Did anybody know that was... Well, we got two heads shaking, yes. So I'm really wondering, because there's a lot of music out there, I think, written by Jews that nobody knows that they were written by Jews. Why do you think that's the case? And I think your book is really ready for a PBS special.
Thank you. Well, yeah. I mean, would you think that I'm an Old Cow Hand is written by a Jew, or Wagon Wheels, or... Sure. Why is that the case? I think it's the case because the Jews, when they came to this country, were very confident in many ways in who they were and where they came from. They were people of the book. And you know, the book is not the Torah. The book is the Talmud. The book is the discussion of the Torah. The Jews are masters of the discussion. As a matter of fact, it's considered inelegant to actually answer a question outright. In the Jewish tradition, questions answered with another question. So what's wrong with that? Right? So there is a confidence in the process, but at the same time, the Jews had been wandering, whatever that means, for thousands of years. And so when I say they discovered America and contextualized a narrative with their America with their narrative, they literally did that. You know, you find movies like, what's the famous Christmas movie with Jimmy Stewart? Well, Jimmy Stewart wasn't Jewish, but that movie was Jewish, about what's American. And there was no mention of Jews, but the idea of what is America and who is an American is a very, very Jewish story. So when you find out that the composer of, I'm an Old Cow Hand or Wagon Wheels might have been Jewish, it's no different than all those rock and roll things that we heard in the 50s that had nothing to do, theoretically, with the Jewish experience, were all part of the Jewish narrative. And there's one more thing that I think, and this could be a stretch, but it's a stretch I like to make. When you consider what's spiritual, what is spiritual? Spiritual, I think, is when we all have a sense that we're connected. That we're all, literally, molecular biology, we all came from the same mother. We go back 70,000 years to the African rift. But it's this idea of caring for one another. And not only caring for one another, but caring for the outsider, for the alienated one. That's a very American concept. And when you see a pop song, it's like a little love song written by a Jewish composer, and maybe the song's about a boy and a girl holding hands. That's just a little sliver of that greater sense of caring. It's like they say, the world has been shattered, and our job is to put it together, is to heal the world. When you look at these Jewish songs, these pop songs, each song is just a little piece of caring for one another. And that's a very Jewish thing. And there's a neurologist named Dan Levitin. He wrote a beautiful book called This Is Your Brain on Music. And in the book he says, the opposite of love isn't hate. The opposite of love is indifference. Caring is what it's about.
You spoke about when the color line really blurred for you. It's when that trumpeter spoke to you. And for me, that happened with Motown. Uh-huh. There was no color. It was just wonderful music. I am here this afternoon, though, to break down one of my last prejudices. Anyone who asks, I will tell them I don't like jazz. Now, I've liked everything that you've presented today. I realize the context is the Jewish contribution to American popular music, but there's somewhat of an amalgam of Tin Pan Alley and rockabilly to some of what you're doing here that I really like. So why don't I like jazz?
It's not jazz that you don't like. Jazz is not a noun. Jazz is a verb. Okay? And originally, 100 years ago, it was a verb being used to designate sexual intercourse. Oh, yeah. But subsequently, when we think about what jazz is an approach. The great singer Jon Hendricks once said, jazz is based on swing, and everything you do can swing. The way you walk down the street can swing. The way you hold your child can swing. We tend to think of jazz today because we have many young people who are wildly educated in the harmonics and the theory of jazz. But they have drifted away from what jazz originally was. Jazz was originally dance music. It was popular music, right? Swing in the 30s was the one time when the art music of America was the same as its popular music. But jazz music basically should be just what I'm talking about in terms of narrative. When I'm playing, I don't think about whether I'm playing jazz or whether I'm playing blues or whether I'm playing rockabilly. I'm thinking, this song is like a map of a territory, and my job is to traverse that map comfortably and tell a story on the way. Sometimes it happens better than other times, but basically every time I'm up there, if I hear a phrase, Art Blakey, the great jazz drummer, once said, if you make a mistake, you're supposed to be professional enough to make that same mistake again and make something out of it. That's how jazz was born. Somebody goofed, right? I say in jazz, there are no mistakes, there are only opportunities, right? So what I'm trying to do up here is keep the forward momentum going, find my voice, say something that rings true to me, and at the same time, be melodic and to tell a musical narrative. To me, that is jazz. To me, you like jazz. You've proved it.
So I'm a fan of some of the artists you got to work with, like Steve Miller or Van Morrison. In that era of rock, would you say there's the same sort of Jewish influence there? Is that something you mentioned in your book?
Yeah. By then, the Jewish influence was in the executive suites and the corporate suites, and there's a whole chapter on Jewish executives as celebrities. You get people like Clive Davis, who himself had his own press agent to publicize himself, not his artists. And you see this expansion of the business as being what defines popular music in America. And in a way, it's kind of the beginning of the end. And you see it all the way up through rap music, you know, with Rick Rubin. But yes, there is, I believe, throughout the entire 20th century, a Jewish story to tell. And certainly Van Morrison and Steve Miller both interacted with it along their paths. Yes?
In your history and study of music, I mean, what have you seen the influence of the klezmer music onto jazz and black music? If you could expound upon the two.
Yeah, a lot of people ask me about klezmer music. Klezmer music is a kind of secular social music that came out of Eastern Russia, turn of the century, came to America and became, in some ways, a breeding ground for jazz musicians. For example, Benny Goodman played the prototypical klezmer instrument, the clarinet. The clarinet is a klezmer instrument, so is the violin. Klezmer is based on improvisation, absolutely. But what it's not based on is the same kind of harmonic structure that jazz has been based on, or blues was based on. The blues harmonic structure came out of church music, and it was delivered in this present form by the African American experience. The harmonic structure of bebop and swing and that was delivered by the Tin Pan Alley writers, the popular songwriters. Like I could play a bebop song for you here. It would sound nothing like I've Got Rhythm, but that's a George Gershwin I've Got Rhythm song. So what klezmer did is it was a way, but again, klezmer in its own way was kind of like a Yiddish theater. Breaking into klezmer was also like breaking into prison, because once you got there, how do you get out and into the popular world? Because klezmer was not popular at all. Now it's become more popular. In fact, if you go to Europe, in Germany, klezmer is very popular because there's this kind of nostalgic for Jews in Germany now. You know, too bad, you know. But the klezmer experience and the Yiddish experience is becoming more and more interesting as we get further and further away from our grandparents and our parents who loved that music personally. Because, you know, it's a classic example of Jews came to America, first generation wanted nothing to do with the Jewish story, second generation were totally American, the third generation turns to the grandparents and say, tell me about the story, and the fourth generation goes back to Europe to find out who they are. And who knows what's coming in the fifth generation. But anyway, klezmer is a very big part of that story, but not a big part of American popular music. My opinion. I could be wrong.
So along comes Ray Charles, and I was very deeply impacted by him, as millions were. Motown comes along. They open up a factory in Detroit. Otis Redding, Marvin Gaye, the Miracles, Four Tops, the Temptations. What was the behind-the-scenes influence? Because a lot of the music began to be written by black people.
Yeah. What was the Jewish influence at Motown? The whole publicity staff, the promoters, the guys who invented the $50 handshake. $50 handshake was you'd go to a radio station, you get your record played. DJ would say, oh, that's a nice-looking record. Take it out of the sleeve, and there's a $50 bill. He said, I think I want to play this record. That's what was Jewish about Motown.
Ben, you've played all over the world, and I'm curious how other musicians, your colleagues, not just culturally, but individually, if they or do they acknowledge the Jewish influence on music and American music?
You know, it's so interesting. No. Who aren't Jewish, are they aware of the Jewish? No, not only are they not aware, but the Jews aren't aware either. I mean, really, nobody's aware of this except the group here. This is it. And it's your job to go out and tell people, because I'll tell you something. The most Jewish thing there is memory. It's memory. And there's a great story in the book, and it's about the Baal Shem Tov and the great rabbi from the Pale of Settlement. And his community was in a terrible, terrible trouble. And so he went into the woods, and in a very special place, he made a very special fire, and he said a very special prayer, and the community was saved. And the next generation, the community was again in trouble, and that rabbi went into the woods, and he made the very special fire in a very special place. He didn't remember the very special prayer, but he said maybe it's sufficient, and it was, and the community was saved. Another generation, big trouble. Rabbi goes in the woods, lights the special fire, but now he doesn't know the right place, he doesn't know the prayer, but he says maybe it's sufficient, and it was. You know it's coming. Next generation, trouble for the community. Rabbi goes into the woods. He doesn't know the prayer. He doesn't know the place. He doesn't know how to light the special fire, but he says maybe just the memory that there was a place, there was a prayer, there was a fire would be enough, and the community will be saved. And it was, and that's why the book is called There Was a Fire, because it's about memory. It's about memory.
Before the lecture, I made a list of arbitrary top 10 Jewish American musician, writers, whatever, and I only came up with one woman, Barbra Streisand. Please tell me that's my ignorance. There are many others that just weren't on my list.
Tell him. Carole King. Who else? Dinah Shore. Oh, there are many. They changed their names, of course. Except Barbra Streisand. The amazing thing about Barbra Streisand is not only did she not change her name, but she did not have her nose fixed. And when you think about this, at that particular era, how courageous that was. She had a large influence on the Jewish community because at the time, in the 50s, when the Jews were becoming assimilated and being invited to join country clubs, everybody was thinking about, getting their nose changed. She did not do it. It was powerful. Yeah.
I know he's not American, but he's had a lot of influence on music, and that's Leonard Cohen. So how does he fit? Because if you look at Leonard Cohen, I mean, his fame is really sort of in the American market.
Leonard Cohen's fame is primarily in the European market, I think. I think that's where his biggest... Now, yes. Well, he went back on the road because his manager stole all his money. And so he went back out and he discovered that he had this huge following, which I think maybe he wasn't even aware of. I can sum up my position on that by saying he's not American. I have nothing to say about Leonard Cohen. You know what? I think we're done. Let's have a drink. Let's sign some books. Thank you.